And now that we've compared the concept of Partzufim to 10 individual Sephirot connected to each other to make what could be described as a spiritual body, which is, so to speak, made up of several spiritual organs, similar to how man's physical body is also made out of different physical organs. And after we clarified by means of the famous anthropomorphic parable that each one of these spiritual organs are paralleled to one of man's physical organs, it is now certainly required of us to speak in great depth about the intimate connection that the spiritual organs of the Partzufim have with man's physical organs. And it goes without saying that the Partzufim in the spiritual worlds certainly do not contain the type of arms and legs that we have down here in the physical world, which are made of flesh and blood. In fact, not only is it nonsensical to assume that there is actually any physical matter in the spiritual godly worlds, but you should know that there is actually a prohibition in the Torah to attribute any physicality to the Almighty or to His spiritual worlds. But with all that said, we still need to understand why the Kabbalistic writings constantly compare the spiritual Sephirot to man's physical organs. To appreciate this famous comparison, we need to take to heart that this is actually the secret behind the famous verse in the Torah, Vayivra Elohim et ha'adam betzalmo, betzelem Elohim bara oto. And God created man in the image of God. And in my humble opinion, it is virtually impossible to understand the true meaning of this verse without understanding the subtle secret behind it. And even Rashi's commentary to the Torah hides the great secret which we're about to clarify. What am I referring to? The truth is that the image of God in which physical man was created is actually the image of the spiritual Partzufim. In fact, when the Torah uses the term Elokim in the verse Tselem Elokim, which means the image of God, it was actually referring to the spiritual Partzufim. But in order to properly appreciate this sensitive secret, we must first straighten out how we view the concept called man. That last statement may probably strike you as slightly puzzling, to say the least. After all, upon first impression, it would seem that man must first and foremost refer to the human race down here in our physical world. But in truth, that is only our first impression, as really the concept of Adam, i.e. of man, is first and foremost a spiritual entity that is found in every single spiritual world and in every single Partzuph. If you remember, we already alluded to this secret when we spoke about the first and highest world called Adam Kadmon. As at that time we mentioned that the Zohar calls this world Adam, since every complete spiritual element, which is comprised of 10 individual Sephirot, is called Adam. And since the first world called Adam Kadmon is also comprised of 10 individual Sephirot, therefore, the intimate connection between these 10 Sephirot is appropriately called Adam. Specifically, Adam Kadmon, as the term Kadmon indicates that this particular Adam is the first set of 10 Sephirot to be emanated inside of the Halal. And based on this definition of Adam, the Arizal continues to use the term Adam with regards to the various Partzufim in Olam HaAtzilut, as well as with regards to the Partzufim in all the other spiritual worlds. Having said that, we should continue to clarify that what Kabbalah calls Adam isn't just any compilation of 10 Sephirot, but specifically the organization of 10 Sephirot in the shape of 3 lines: right, left, and center, which represent 3 different modes of godly behavior, which are Chesed, i.e. mercy, Din, which is the measure of exacting justice and vengeance, and Rachamim, which is the balance between the two. And when we examine the shape of the spiritual Partzufim, we see that the right line of the Partzufim contains 3 Sephirot: Chokhmah, Chesed, and Netzach. Meanwhile, we see how the left line of the Partzufim contains 3 other Sephirot: Binah, Gevurah, and Hod. And when we examine the center line of the Partzufim as well, we find that it contains the remaining 4 Sephirot: Keter, Tiferet, Yesod, and Malchut. And when we further examine the shape of the spiritual Partzufim, we notice how besides the above-mentioned breakdown into 3 vertical lines, they also have another breakdown into 3 more regions. How so? Because the Partzufim have a head, so to speak, which contains the Sephirot Keter, Chokhmah, and Binah. The Partzufim also have a midsection, so to speak, which contains the Sephirot Chesed, Gevurah, and Tiferet. Finally, the Partzufim also have a lower section, which contains the Sephirot Netzach, Hod, Yesod, and Malchut. And when we take to heart this combination of the vertical and horizontal alignments of the 10 Sephirot that make up each and every Partzuf, we should begin to understand that this organic arrangement is indeed appropriately called Adam. And this is really the point that I wanted to clarify. That this particular shape of the 10 Sephirot, organized as a Partzuf, is actually what's called Adam first and foremost, and not the physical man down in this world. So what's the relationship between the spiritual Adam and the physical Adam? When the Almighty decided to create physical man down in this world, He decided to create him in the shape and image that the spiritual Adam has in the spiritual world, which, as we learned, is the shape of the 10 Sephirot, organized as a Partzuph. And since all of these Partzufim are obviously the Almighty's godly elements that make up His spiritual worlds, therefore, they are also called God in some respect. If so, we can finally understand that this must be the image of God that man was created in, as expressed in the verse, Vayivra Elohim et ha'adam betzalmo, betzelem Elohim bara'oto. And God created man in the image of God. However, it goes without saying that the Creator Himself, in His purest form as the Ein Sof, has no image whatsoever. It's only after He emanated the Sephirot and organized them in the shape of Partzufim did it become permitted to us to speak in terms of the image of God. Only then we can say that when the Torah taught us that man was created in the image of God, it was actually teaching us that man was created in the image of the spiritual Partzufim. Inasmuch, when we examine physical man's appearance, we can appreciate why we also have a right side, which contains our right brain and right arm and right leg. And this is why we also have a left side, which contains our left brain and left arm and left leg. And this is also why we have a vertical center, which contains our skull and our torso and our reproductive organ, i.e. the brit, as well as its crown, what's called the atara. And when we continue to further examine physical man's appearance, we come to appreciate why we also have a head, which contains our skull as well as our right and left brain. And this is also why we have a midsection, which contains our right and left arms and the torso between them. And this is also why we have a lower section, which contains our right and left legs, as well as our brit and its crown, i.e. the atara. And although we just went out of our way to point out how the 10 Sephirot parallel man's physical organs, nevertheless, we cannot make the grave mistake of entertaining the thought that the spiritual worlds actually have a man that looks almost like the physical man, with the only difference between them being that the spiritual man is somewhat more purified than the physical man, i.e. that the spiritual man has a certain glow to him, or that he is see-through, etc. God forbid to think that this was the intention of the Kabbalists when they made the famous comparison between the spiritual man and the physical man. Certainly, the organs that make up the spiritual man look nothing like the physical appearance of our physical organs. So you'll ask, then what are these spiritual organs? And why did we compare our physical organs to these spiritual organs if they don't really look alike? What you must understand and take to heart is that the spiritual organs that make up the Partzuphim are merely different forces and abilities which the Creator takes on in order to monitor and govern the physical world. But by no means are their spiritual organs similar in their shape or appearance to our physical organs, since these spiritual entities certainly do not have any shape or any appearance that our physical brain can possibly grasp. So now I expect you to ask me why we compare the 10 Sephirot to our physical organs if indeed they have no similarity to each other. To that I'll answer that they do actually have a similarity to each other, but not in their shape or their appearance like we could have mistakenly thought. In order to properly appreciate the subtle relationship between man's physical organs and the 10 Sephirot that make up the Partzufim, will fall upon the words of the classic book Shomer Emunim HaKadmon. There the author clarifies that all the spiritual organs that make up what's called the Partzuph, such as its arms and legs and brit, are called by these names only because of the actions that the Almighty carries out with these spiritual entities, and not because they have any shape or form that our arms or our legs and our brit have, God forbid. For example, just as man has physical legs with which he walks, and physical hands with which he grabs or passes, and eyes with which he sees and observes, and ears with which he hears, to go along with all the other physical organs with which man does all the human actions that we are familiar with in our physical world, so too up in the spiritual worlds, the Partzufim also have parallel Sephirot which serve as the spiritual organs, so to speak, with which the Creator carries out similar actions to those that man executes with his physical organs. For example, the power, or more accurately, the Sephirah, with which the Ein Sof oversees and monitors the events in our physical world is called his eyes, so to speak. And don't let that surprise you too much, as after all, we have explicit verses in the Torah that speaks of God's eyes, such as Einei Hashem Elokecha ba mereshit hashana vad acharit shana. As that verse describes how the eyes of God monitor Eretz Yisrael from the beginning of the year till the end of the year. In short, God has the power of vision. Similarly, the power, or more accurately the Sephirah, with which God receives the voice of our prayers and examines how earnest they really are, is called his ears, so to speak. And that too shouldn't surprise you, since we find verses that imply that God has the power of hearing. For example, Vayishma Elokim et kol hana'ar, a verse which describes how God heard the prayer of Ishmael. And although till this stage of our learning we've been limiting our discussion only to the 10 Sephirot, and we did not delineate all 613 spiritual organs that each Partzuph actually has, in truth you should know that since physical man has 613 organs and sinews, therefore certainly the spiritual Partzuphim also have 613 spiritual organs and sinews, as each spiritual detail is actually one specific power that parallels what human beings do with their own 613 physical features. But let us not forget the rule of thumb, which states that all of these spiritual organs are parallel to our physical organs only with regards to the actions that God executes with them, but not to say that they resemble our physical organs in any way, shape, or form, God forbid. With that, we should finally be able to appreciate the great secret that the Torah alluded to when it taught us that man was created in the image of God, B'Tselem Elokim. The key to understanding this secret lies in the realization that throughout the Torah, the term El means power or ability or authority. If so, that means that the holy name Elohim is actually the plural of El. In other words, many powers or many abilities or many authorities. We therefore learn that the term Elohim is an allusion to the numerous powers and abilities which God, so to speak, takes on in order to monitor and govern this physical world. And now that we understand the meaning of Elohim, we can proceed to appreciate what the Torah must have meant with the term Tselem Elohim in reference to man being created in the image of God. When the Torah stated that man was created in the image of God, it must have been referring to the organization of these godly powers and abilities in the shape of a Partzuph. And what is that shape? This is the organization of three lines: right, left, and center, which correspond to the measures Chesed, Din, and Rachamim. Additionally, the Partzufim are also organized in three other levels, which are the head, the mid-section, and the lower section. And what do these last three levels symbolize? They symbolize the steps in which the Almighty's governing develops and then makes its way down to this world. How so? At first, the Almighty, so to speak, entertains in his head how he wants to govern this world. In the next stage, what was decided in the head then makes its way down to the body, where it takes on more and more form as it makes its way closer and closer towards the bottom of the body, until it eventually galvanizes into a specific action that reaches our physical world. And when the Almighty decided to create man down here in the physical world, because he cherished man so much, he decided to create man's physical body in the same organization that the Almighty's spiritual powers have, i.e., in the organization of a Partzuph. After all, physical man is the purpose of creation, since everything that the Almighty intended to achieve with the creation of the worlds will necessarily be achieved through man. Because of that, the Almighty created physical man in the image of his very own spiritual powers, in order to give man his appropriate esteem. In fact, this secret is already alluded to in the book of Iyov, in the verse, "Bibesari echazeh Elokah," i.e., from my flesh I envisage God. What did Iyov mean by that statement? He wanted to impress upon us that should man inspect his physical makeup and focus upon the different actions and powers that he is able to accomplish with each of his physical organs, man will get a glimpse into the arrangement of the spiritual powers that God works with. In other words, Iyov was telling us that the physical body resembles the spiritual arrangement of the Partzuphim. As it is said, "From my flesh I envisage God." And when we follow Iyov's advice and examine our physical body, we find that man is indeed made in the image of the spiritual Partzufim, which is the image of God, as evident from our three-dimensional build made out of three descending lines: right, left, and center, as well as from our other partition with a head, a midsection, and a lower section. More specifically, we come to appreciate why physical man also has a head that contains our skull, that corresponds to the Sephirot called Keter, and our right brain that corresponds to the Sephirot called Chokhmah, as well as our left brain that corresponds to the Sephirot called Binah. Additionally, this is why man also has a midsection that contains our right arm that corresponds to the Sephirah called Chesed, and our left arm that corresponds to the Sephirah called Gevurah, and our torso that corresponds to the Sephirah called Tiferet. And of course, this is why physical man also has a lower section that contains our right leg that corresponds to the Sephirah called Netzach, and our left leg that corresponds to the Sephirah called Hod, as well as our Brit, which corresponds to the Sephirah called Yesod, as well as the crown on top of our Brit that corresponds to the Sephirah called Malchut. And don't be shocked by the fact that the spiritual Partzufim have spiritual organs that correspond to our physical reproductive organs, namely the Sephirot called Yesod and Malchut. As after all, Iyov impressed upon us that from my flesh I envisage God. And since man's physical body certainly has organs with which he is able to reproduce and give birth to the next generation, perforce that means that the spiritual Partzufim must also have spiritual organs with which they unite and give birth to the next generation of Partzufim. Not only that, but since physical man has both male and female genders with different physical bodies, then that should be a clear indication that in the spiritual worlds there must also be both male and female Partzufim who unite with each other in order to reproduce the next generation of Partzufim. However, we are nowhere ready to delve into deep discussions about the process of unification between the male and the female Partzufim, nor about the spiritual pregnancy stage that follows, or the birth stage, or the infant stage, and so on. But please God, we'll continue learning together with much conviction, and eventually we'll get there. And you can probably sense that even regarding the very general topics that we did touch upon in this session, there is still much more below the surface. However, I feel confident that we laid down the foundations sufficiently for now.